Alright guys, welcome to Formula 1 News. Max Verstappen has been defeated twice in the last 3 Grand Prix by Ferrari and by McLaren. The question is, when we go to Montreal, will a similar story reoccur yet again? Red Bull are concerned a difficult weekend in Monaco might be replicated given the circuit characteristics here in Canada. Could we have another weekend with Max Verstappen not on the top step of the podium? Very much enjoyed your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I would greatly appreciate it. First of all, Esteban Ocon, he's been talking a lot over the last few days, obviously because he was meant to be getting benched. That's what we thought, right? There were certainly rumours to that effect, that Ocon was going to be disciplined for the events of the first lap in Monaco, and therefore was going to be, well, got rid of. This is what he said on the day after the fact. Yesterday, though, he did a series of tweets, and I think he put something similar on his Instagram as well, discussing exactly what's happened. And I don't know if he wanted to write this. I don't know if Alpine's PR team forced him to write this, but, well, it's an absolute essay is what it is. So Ocon says, much has been said in the aftermath of the Monaco Grand Prix. While I've received many messages of support, I have been deeply saddened by the amount of abuse and negativity that I've received online regarding my character, my driving, and my career. So feel free to read this if you want to. I won't say Esteban's necessarily wrong in what he says. I was just kind of surprised that it was said, to be honest. And he then goes on to say a few down, but the misinformed statement and gross distortions that I've seen online in recent days about my ability to work with a team have been inaccurate, hurtful, and damaging. Obviously, you know, people saying that, look at Ocon's tenure, the teammates that he's had, the conflicts that have occurred with certain teammates. Is there a common denominator there? So he says, look, I've always approached the sport with humility, professionalism, respect. And Ocon, in some ways, is a character that it's nice to support because he's one of the only drivers that isn't, you know, for lack of a better term, a nepo baby, right? There's only a few drivers on the grid, very few at all, that actually haven't come into the sport through money, that they've grafted, they've sacrificed, their family has sacrificed to get them, you know, this opportunity, and they've taken advantage of it. The difficulty is that it's tough to root for Ocon when you actually watch his actions on track, and that I still think remains true for me and for many. But he does this big statement here, and then he actually concludes by saying, look, I will be competing in Montreal. I'm not getting dropped in front of the fantastic Canadian fans. And this is just a general feeling in sports at the moment, and, you know, remains true across sports and esports and everywhere. Given the fact that nowadays people are more online, you can easily interact, you know, you can easily just reply to Ocon with your anonymous account and send him all the trash talk you want. That is just the nature of the world nowadays, and drivers and personalities, I think, need to be careful with how they interact with that kind of environment. But at the same time, this is sports. You're getting paid a lot of money to do a thing. If you do it badly, people are going to criticize you. Some people are going to criticize you to an extreme extent, far beyond what might be considered fair. My feeling tends to be, if you can't handle the heat, you've got to get out of the kitchen. But look, Esteban Ocon will be racing in Canada. We think there's going to be some sort of pact between Alpine's drivers to say, don't crash into each other anymore, or you're getting fired, or you've got to pay for the damages, or whatever. We're not really sure. But Ocon is on the list of Haas, actually. Haas are, surprisingly, given where we thought they might start the season, in a really interesting spot in the driver market, because they're almost certainly signing Ollie Behrman. That seems to be the way that they're going. Their other driver is a bit of a question mark. They could sign Tsunoda. That's a possibility. They could sign Ocon. They could sign even potentially Sainz, although that feels unlikely. Bottas is an option. You know, it's a few drivers out there they could look for. They could keep Magnussen, but yeah, I don't know about that on recent performances. Tsunoda as well I wanted to mention, just because it feels to me that the battle between Tsunoda and RB, in terms of from a contract point of view, is, well, the leverage is with Yuki, shall we say, at the moment, because Red Bull CEO Peter Bayer, I said Red Bull, didn't I? RB CEO Peter Bayer, I'm still reading it wrong, basically was asked the question, do you want to retain Yuki? And he said, yeah, like, we'd love to retain Yuki. He's performing very well. We like him at the team, etc., etc. Good for Red Bull, Honda, all this stuff. But obviously, Yuki might have another idea, and he's actually gone on his first ever in his entire career, Tsunoda, 3-race stretch of scoring points. P7 in Miami, P10 in Imola, P8 in Monaco. So pretty cool stuff from Yuki, and outperforming Ricciardo at the moment. Kind of surprised that Red Bull aren't even considering him as the driver. Obviously, we can see here Mr. Sergio Perez in the background, but that means that Tsunoda has some degree of leverage when it comes to contract negotiations. I'm sure he's talking to teams. There's talk about Haas. There's talk about other options out there, even Alpine potentially, just because if Yuki's never going to get the Red Bull seat, probably makes sense to leave the Red Bull family and, you know, go and drive somewhere else for some time and then maybe try and get the Ferrari seat or certainly the Aston Martin seat. The problem there is that Lance Stroll says he is still committed to the Aston Martin project. But Aston are in such an interesting spot because Mercedes are pulling away from them. Their rivals at one point, McLaren, I mean, it was only a year or so ago where Alonso was still scoring highly regular podiums and McLaren were nowhere near. This time, this year, very different story indeed. Ferrari have gone obviously way further ahead. So Aston seem to be struggling with some understanding of their car right now, and people are suggesting that it might be rear suspension related because they use the same setup as Mercedes, and Mercedes have also struggled to understand their car, maybe, but Merc seem to be kind of getting on top of it to some degree. Obviously, there's been also the talk about Sergio Perez. Every day at this point, we get more discussions, articles, analysis that implies that Perez is going to stay at Red Bull. There's a few reasons why this becomes plausible and even rather likely, one of which is because in terms of marketing pull, we talk about Daniel Ricciardo being a crucial factor there, which I think he is for RB to some degree, but 65%, roughly that kind of number, of all of Red Bull's merchandising sales goes to Mexico, and Sergio Perez is a massive reason why. Like, they've got world champion Max Verstappen, but Perez sells more merch than Max does by quite some margin, actually. So I guess that must be in the consideration. I mean, I've got to think it must be, because otherwise surely they would replace him, especially because putting Carlos Sainz in the team, yes, that would cause some friction, but, with what we discussed with Christian Horner over the last couple of months, trying to take more power and control of the organisation, I thought that even might be a sensible move to kind of show Verstappen that, look, I run the show around here, you don't. But maybe because Red Bull's car is getting more, competitive with the rest of the field, shall we say, the others are closing up, maybe Horner doesn't want to push Verstappen away by, showing his hand in that way. So he'd kind of prefer to keep Verstappen on side and happy, and therefore keep Perez around, because the Mercedes 2026 engine project is looking kind of spicy. So there's so many factors in play here, but the feeling is that, yeah, Perez will stay. The rumour today was that the deal is not done, but the decision is made. Perez will stay. It's now a matter of deciding the terms of the contract from the Perez side and from the Red Bull side. But until the contract is signed, there's always a chance that something else happens. And until it's announced, I imagine Carlos Sainz will bide his time in terms of where he goes next. Of course, Hamilton will be his replacement at Ferrari. Toto Wolff with some nice words here on Lewis and says, look, if Ferrari can give him a competitive car, he can win the championship, no doubt about it. When Lewis moves to Ferrari, he will become an opponent, but I will always wish him happy days. So I thought that was relatively nice, but of course Mercedes is still looking at their own situation. Hamilton even says, look, at McLaren, what they've done, clearly the engine isn't the problem. We talked about this in 2022 when the 5% biofuels came in, that, wow, if Mercedes got it wrong, their engine didn't seem as strong. And that kind of remains true. Like, it doesn't seem like Mercedes have the strongest overall power unit package on the grid. Red Bull still seem to have the edge there with the Honda electrical side, which seems to still be the gold standard. Ferrari have a strong power unit, obviously, that doesn't seem to explode as much nowadays. And then maybe Mercedes are there or thereabouts. But it's quite clear in the hands of McLaren, it's not a problem, right? Mercedes power can still win, as shown in Miami. But, Mercedes haven't put the package together to do it. The feeling then still is that in 2026, Merc are the team to watch. And Mercedes are very excited about the potential of those 2026 engines. So this is why, Mercedes are really confident about that. Russell's really confident about it. And I'm sure Verstappen is at least looking at the situation, because if Mercedes can get in kind of, podium territory this season, certainly depending on what happens next year, there is an opportunity to Toto Wolff, for Toto Wolff to get his wish and to put Verstappen in the car. The very interesting thing for me would be, let's say Antonelli joins Mercedes next year, and then magically Verstappen becomes available and wants to join for 2026 because he feels like the Red Bull engine project isn't working, or whatever the case is, or he gets pushed out because of internal drama, who knows. But let's say that happens. Who do you drop if you're Toto Wolff? Like, do you kick Antonelli back to the curb after a season, despite bringing him in as a rookie? Or, depending on the results of the season, I guess you would have to make the decision, do you get rid of Russell, right? Is it Russell Verstappen? Is it Verstappen Antonelli? Like, what's the decision? Because, Antonelli's meant to be this kind of Verstappen-esque prodigy, but if you can get the real Verstappen, obviously you do that. So, probably not a question that's going to be necessary, I would say, but it's certainly one that's not out of the realms of possibility, actually, when you think of the events of the last couple of months. Speaking of the problems that Red Bull currently have, and of course, problems that if they continue, that whole Verstappen-Mercedes idea is not out of the realms of possibility, that the simulator and reality are not correlating when it comes down to the curbs, when it comes down to the bumps on the circuit. This is what Red Bull have been struggling with in Monaco, and certainly in Miami. Imola, they were fine. I mean, the track should be pretty damn good for Red Bull, but even then, the final stint, Verstappen didn't have the tyre kind of temperatures that he wanted, and they had to make setup compromises, Red Bull, in order to still end up winning the Grand Prix. But it took a calculated drive from Verstappen and some defending in the last couple of laps to actually make it work, and of course, you need like 8/10 a lap delta to overtake around Imola nowadays, so realistically, there was no chance of Norris winning unless he had a mega delta, and he pretty much ran out of tyres anyway. But Canada, what sort of challenge will that hold for certainly the Red Bull? Because Helmut Marko says it could also be a difficult weekend. Now, they've said this over the last couple of seasons, and usually when a dominant team says, oh, we might struggle this time, this is the time that somebody else is going to win, I'm like, all right, yeah, here we go again. We've heard it all before. Mercedes have done it, Red Bull have done it, or we're going to struggle this time, this team is going to be really strong, and then they turn up and they win by 20 seconds, and that's happened over the last couple of years at times. But to be fair, if there was ever a time that I would believe Helmut Marko saying that they might struggle this weekend, it is probably right about now, because they said this going into Monaco. They expected a difficult weekend, and they got it right. Perez was out in P18, Verstappen was P6 in the end after hitting the wall in qualifying. Maybe he could have got P3, but of course, then he was stuck P6 for the rest of the Grand Prix. And Marko says, yeah, the problem starts in the simulator. It signaled the car was going over the curbs perfectly, but of course, that was not the case. We're optimistic we can at least find out why the simulator produces data that doesn't correspond to reality, but they don't seem to be there yet. Montreal could also be a difficult weekend. So Canada as a circuit is one that you have to ride the curbs. There's plenty of corners on the track where you've got to be mounting all over the curbs. Now, the circuit is also kind of a street track in a way. It's kind of like a hybrid in some sense. To me, it feels like a racetrack, but technically it has some street circuit characteristics and vibes. So it is bumpy in parts, as is Monaco, for example. And in those circumstances, Red Bull have struggled. This does seem to be the one flaw in the Red Bull car that Adrian Newey implied quite a while ago. And maybe it's a necessary sacrifice for having the best car, because if your car is the best when it's running close to the ground, maybe when you don't run it so close to the ground, it's naturally going to be quite weak. And maybe we're only really seeing that now because the other teams have actually upped their game. But Red Bull basically say they have to run their car low to the ground, and if they can't, they lose a lot of downforce, probably more downforce from doing it than other teams do, and they probably generate more downforce closer to the floor than other teams do. So when we go to, let's say, Spain, I'm still expecting them to be dominant, and that was actually what Helmut Marko, I think, said elsewhere. Actually, he says it right here, doesn't he? If we're not ahead in Barcelona, then we will really have a problem, because that's a circuit they should dominate, and a circuit where they should be well suited. If they can't replicate their performance last year, again, even the year before in Barcelona this year, then they have a problem. Until then, they're still confident enough here, Red Bull, that they're going to be fine for the respective championships. But interesting to note, our car has a concept where we are very focused on aerodynamic efficiency. We can't raise it off the ground to better handle the curbs without losing a lot of downforce. I believe we still have the advantage, therefore, on traditional circuits. On circuits where we are not the most competitive, we can count on the Verstappen factor, which is pretty funny, because this is kind of like the Mercedes strategy, isn't it, for several years, when it was like, all right, Lewis Hamilton, a set of medium tyres, and inshallah, like, let's just hope that it works out. And it's funny that Red Bull are now kind of saying the same thing. It's like, well, the car isn't great, it's not great over the bumps, but, we'll give it to Max and we'll see what he can do. A set of tyres, a 2.0 second pit stop, and we'll send him away, and hopefully he can win the race. And that's, I'm sure, not exactly what Max wants to hear right now. Like, he would prefer a car that was so much better that he could comfortably win. Perez would be comfortably second, and championship over. But of course, it's not championship over right now. There's 31 points between Verstappen and Leclerc, which is still a sizable lead. But, maybe not forever if things were to continue to go wrong here for Verstappen. So the fact that Marko is saying, yeah, Canada might be somewhat problematic and we've got to rely on Max to pull off, masterclasses every single weekend if we want to win the races. And obviously the implication therefore is that Perez is not going to be doing all that much in this current state of the Red Bull. And as I say, Canada, because it has those street characteristics, can be bumpy. The one benefit the Red Bull do have going into Canada is that they've resurfaced the track. So the bumps should be less of a factor, but honestly, who really knows whether the resurfacing will be good or bad for them? And you're still going to be running curbs in Canada. That's what you do. And if the Red Bull is still going to struggle with that, then it may be another difficult weekend. I will say this run of races from, Miami to Imola to Monaco to Canada, and I think onwards it goes, Austria, where it probably would be okay for Red Bull there, but there's still some curbs you've got to ride in a couple of corners. Then I think it goes to Spain, right? So that's where Red Bull should be back on real top form, especially because there's not even that final chicane anymore where you do have to kind of go over the curb somewhat. And then it goes to Silverstone. So, this probably will be, this round and maybe the next rounds, some of the most difficult tracks on the entire Canada for Red Bull. You can, of course, look further forward to circuits like Singapore and say, yeah, well, that might not be great for them either, as of course we've seen in previous years. But at the same time, probably this is one of the hardest stretches of tracks. Like, it's quite possible that if Red Bull are good in Canada or they win in Canada, there probably is no hope, because from then to the end of the season, generally they will be more favourable tracks for the Red Bull. But everyone seems to believe, Ferrari, McLaren, that they ain't far away. We're talking a tenth and a half, even on Red Bull's good day. We'll see if that's true, because to me, it doesn't feel long ago we were in China and Verstappen was lapping a second lap quicker than anybody else was capable of. So, we'll see if that form ever returns at some point this season. And Max says, look, it's not me, I've not fallen off. Give anyone this car and see if they can do a better job with it than I can. And this is the general feeling, right, of many of the teams, that you bring an upgrade that might take you from 5th to 1st. Like, that is the general feeling. And Mercedes aren't even too far away, based on Monaco, from being in a similar conversation with Red Bull, McLaren and Ferrari. Just before we close out the video, I wanted to mention a couple of very fascinating things. This almost seems unreal, but I'm pretty certain this is actually true. McLaren have not scored a point in Canada since 2014, when Button got P4. Since then, obviously, the McLaren Honda days were tragic in many ways, and even in recent times, they were bad there the last couple of years. So, is this going to change this time? Surely it is, right? I mean, Norris broke the winless curse, Leclerc broke the Monaco curse. Maybe it's time for the McLaren Canada curse, because no points in a decade is actually wild for a team like McLaren, and you would expect that to change probably rather emphatically this weekend. This was another talking point. We talked about this maybe yesterday, day before, a couple of days ago anyway, on Monaco, how you improve it. And the discussion was, can we make it so that we have to do more pit stops? Because usually it's a straightforward one stop, and this race, because of the red flag, it was effectively a 0 stop for many of the drivers, and that worked fine. One option is to mandate soft tyres, but what was said, because in Monaco, you can probably drive 7, 8, maybe even 9 seconds a lap off the pace, and you still can't get overtaken because there simply is nowhere to pass. As long as you go quick in the right areas and you'll keep the guy behind, you can manage your tyres so much. And it's actually more effective to do that than go for a pit stop and, do the alternative. So the feeling was that if we give the drivers the C5, they will probably still just one stop it. They will just go so slow to achieve that. Now, if you give them a C6, an even softer compound, an ultra soft, a hyper soft, whatever you want to say, make it pink maybe like it used to be. I'd love to see that back on the car again. But something like that, that tyre is not going to last. Even if you try and preserve it, it's not going to last long enough. So that's the idea, maybe, that introduce a C6 compounds that may be even mandated. I don't know, they could do something like that to use on the street circuit, so that you try and encourage better racing by giving more strategic options, as it were, than having like one default easy strategy to execute. So just interesting to note that Pirelli are trying things, just because Monaco probably aren't going to change their track layout. I think that is relatively clear. So very much interested your thoughts in the comment section below. And also on this question, will Red Bull win the Constructors' title this year? They are 24 points ahead right now of Ferrari. I'm going to say that they will, because I'm still not convinced that the other teams are actually that much closer to Red Bull yet. I think I need to see 1 or 2 more weekends before you're going to be able to convince me that what I've been watching for the last 2 years has actually ended and it's going to be competitive. I'm still not convinced. I think, if Verstappen's still a half a second a lap clear ahead in Barcelona, then I don't really think it matters so much. Canada doesn't go so well, and Austria doesn't go so well, or at least it's very competitive at the front of the field. I may very well change my opinion. So very much interested your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care, and I'll see you next time.